The sandwich shop was called Moritz Schiller's Delicatessen. It stood on a corner in Sarajevo, on a street called Franz Josef Street, named, ironically, for the aged Austrian emperor whose world was about to end. On June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old boy with tuberculosis stood outside that shop, having given up on his mission, contemplating his failure and probably his lunch. His name was Gavrilo Princip. 2 hours earlier, he and 6 co-conspirators had positioned themselves along the parade route of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. They carried bombs and pistols. Their plan was to assassinate the Archduke during his ceremonial visit to Sarajevo. The plan had failed spectacularly. One conspirator had thrown a bomb that bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded under the vehicle behind it. The other conspirators had frozen, unable to act. Princip himself had lost his nerve and let the motorcade pass. The assassination attempt was over. The conspirators were scattering. Princip stood outside Schiller's, defeated, when the Archduke's car, having taken a wrong turn, the driver, confused about the revised route, reversed course and stopped directly in front of him. The car stalled. The engine died. Franz Ferdinand sat there, 5 feet away, a perfect target presented by pure accident. Princip stepped forward and fired twice. The first bullet hit the Archduke's wife, Sophie, in the abdomen. The second hit the Archduke in the neck, severing his jugular. Both would be dead within minutes, and within 6 weeks, Europe would be at war. A war that would kill 17 million people, destroy 4 empires, and shatter a world that had believed itself civilized and progressive and beyond such barbarism. This is the story of how a tubercular teenager accidentally started the worst war humanity had yet known. But it is also the story of how that war was not an accident at all. How Europe had built a machine designed to turn a single spark into a continental conflagration. How nationalism and imperialism and alliance systems created conditions where one death could trigger millions. How the world sleepwalked into catastrophe and then could not find the brakes. Before we begin this journey through assassination and escalation, a gentle note. If these evening explorations help you understand the past and its echoes in our present, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps others discover these stories. And we're curious about your thoughts. Let us know in the comments which moment of this crisis resonates most with you, or which other turning points you'd like us to explore. Now, as the day releases its hold and the quieter hours approach, let us travel back to 1914. To a Europe that seemed stable and prosperous and permanent, standing unknowingly on the edge of an abyss. We will meet the boy who pulled the trigger, understand why he did it, trace the 28 days from assassination to World War, and ask whether any of it could have been prevented, or whether the catastrophe was inevitable from the moment the alliances were signed and the armies were mobilized and the generals began planning for the war they all believed was coming. This is the bedtime history of how one death led to millions, how accident and design combined to produce catastrophe, how the modern world was born in the trenches of a war that no one really wanted, but that everyone helped create. But first, we must understand the boy with the pistol, who he was, what he believed, and why he was willing to die to kill a man he had never met. Gavrilo Princip was born in 1894 in a village so small and remote that it barely appears on maps. Oblij, in western Bosnia, was a collection of stone houses clinging to barren hillsides where shepherds tended flocks and families lived as their ancestors had for centuries. Princip's family were serfs, not legally, not by that date, but practically. They farmed land they did not own, paid dues to landowners, lived lives circumscribed by poverty and tradition. Bosnia had been part of the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. Then, in 1878, Austria-Hungary occupied it, and in 1908 formally annexed it. The Bosnians, a mix of Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks, had no say in this transaction. Their land was simply transferred from one empire to another, from Ottoman to Habsburg rule. For young Serbs like Princip, this was intolerable. They were Serbs, they believed, and should be part of Serbia, not subjects of a German-speaking Catholic empire that treated Slavs as inferior. Princip was the fourth of 9 children, though 6 of his siblings died in infancy or childhood, normal for the time and place, but a fact that shaped him. He was small, sickly, serious. His father saw promise in him and sent him to Sarajevo for education, a significant sacrifice for a poor family. In the city, Princip encountered a world his village had never known. Newspapers, political movements, radical ideas, the intoxicating possibility that the world could be changed through action rather than simply endured. He also encountered Serbian nationalism, the belief that all Serbs should be united in a single nation-state free from imperial control. This was a powerful idea in the early 20th century, part of the broader nationalist movements tearing at Europe's multi-ethnic empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, and Italians. Most of these peoples were developing national consciousnesses, imagining themselves as distinct nations that deserved self-determination. The empire could not satisfy these aspirations without dissolving itself. In 1912, Princip tried to join the Serbian army during the Balkan Wars, conflicts in which Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece fought the Ottoman Empire and then each other over territory. He was rejected as too small and too weak. The rejection humiliated him. He was willing to die for the Serbian cause, and they told him he was too frail to be useful. Then came the tuberculosis diagnosis. In 1914, tuberculosis was a death sentence, especially for someone of Princip's class and circumstances. He had perhaps a few years to live, probably less. He was 19 years old and dying slowly, coughing blood, growing weaker. What could such a person do with the time remaining? Princip found his answer in a secret society called Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, unification or death, better known as the Black Hand. This was a shadowy organization of Serbian military officers, nationalists, and radicals committed to creating a greater Serbia that would include all Serbs regardless of current borders. The Black Hand used terrorism as a weapon, assassinations, bombings, propaganda, anything that might destabilize Austria-Hungary and advance Serbian interests. The organization's leader was Colonel Dragutin Dmitrievich, known by the codename Apis after the Egyptian bull god. He was a formidable figure, a veteran of the 1903 coup that had assassinated Serbia's king and replaced him with a more nationalist dynasty. Apis understood power and was willing to use any means to achieve his goals. He saw Austria-Hungary as Serbia's mortal enemy and believed violence was the only language empires understood. In 1914, tradition dictated that June 28th was Vidovdan, St. Vitus Day, the anniversary of the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, the most sacred date in Serbian national mythology. For the Archduke to visit Sarajevo on that date was a provocation, intentional or not, and Franz Ferdinand was the perfect target, heir to the throne, symbol of Habsburg power, the man who would one day rule the empire that kept Serbs divided. Apis recruited 3 teenage boys for the assassination: Gavrilo Princip, Nedeljko Čabrinović, and Trifko Grabiš. All were Bosnian Serbs. All were students. All were young enough to be shaped by nationalist fervor and old enough to act on it. The Black Hand trained them, gave them weapons, Belgian-made FN 1910 pistols and bombs, and sent them back to Bosnia with instructions to kill the Archduke. 3 other conspirators joined them in Sarajevo: Vaso Čubrilović, age 17, Cvetko Popović, age 18, and Mohamed Mehmedabasić, age 27. 6 assassins positioned along the parade route. Surely one of them would succeed. But what drove these boys to commit murder? For Princip, it was a complex mixture. There was nationalism, the genuine belief that he was serving his people by killing their oppressor. There was the romantic notion of sacrifice, that dying for the cause would give his brief life meaning. There was the tuberculosis, the knowledge that he was dying anyway, that he had nothing to lose, that he might as well use his death for something. There was also something darker, the certainty that violence was necessary, that empires only understood force, that progress required blood. These boys had internalized the era's most dangerous idea, that terrorism could change history, that individual acts of violence could trigger larger transformations. They were right, terribly right, but the transformation they triggered was not the one they imagined. Let us be clear about Franz Ferdinand. He was not a tyrant. In fact, within the Habsburg system, he was relatively progressive. He believed the empire needed to reform, to give its Slavic populations more autonomy and respect. He opposed the hardliners who wanted to crush Serbian nationalism through force. Ironically, his death removed the one man who might have prevented the empire's harsh response to his assassination. His visit to Sarajevo was partly political, to inspect military maneuvers, and partly personal. June 28th was his wedding anniversary. He had brought his wife Sophie, whom he loved deeply despite court opposition to their marriage. She was not of sufficient royal rank, and Habsburg protocol normally barred her from appearing alongside him at official events. But in Sarajevo, the rules were relaxed. They could appear together publicly, almost like an ordinary couple. The Archduke's security was shockingly inadequate by modern standards. The route was published in advance, the crowds were not searched, the motorcade was slow and exposed. There were local police, but no heavy security presence. Perhaps the authorities did not take the threat seriously enough. Perhaps they were incompetent. Perhaps, in a city that had seen no major political violence, they simply could not imagine that students with pistols would attempt regicide. On the morning of June 28th, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie left their hotel for the town hall reception. The motorcade, 6 cars moving slowly through the streets, passed the first conspirator, Mehmedabasic. He froze. Later, he would claim a policeman was standing too close, that he could not act without being caught. The second conspirator, Vaso Chubrilovic, also hesitated and did nothing. Then came Chabrinovic. He was standing on the Apel Quay alongside the Miljacka River. As the Archduke's car approached, he pulled the bomb from his coat, struck the detonator cap against a lamppost to activate the 10-second fuse, and threw it at the car. But the driver saw the movement and accelerated. The bomb bounced off the folded-back convertible roof, fell into the street, and exploded under the car behind them, wounding about 20 people, some seriously. Chabrinovic swallowed his cyanide pill. The conspirators had been given cyanide to take after the attack to avoid capture, and jumped into the river. The cyanide was old and weak, and only made him vomit. The river was barely 4 inches deep in that season. Police pulled him out, drenched and retching, and arrested him. The assassination attempt had failed. Franz Ferdinand's car continued to the town hall. The Archduke was furious. "So you welcome your guests here with bombs?" he shouted at the mayor. But he composed himself, gave his planned speech, ad-libbing a few lines about the bombing, and debated what to do next. Should they cancel the remaining events and leave Sarajevo? Should they continue as planned, showing that they would not be intimidated? Franz Ferdinand decided to visit the hospital to see the people wounded by the bomb. This was compassionate and also politically smart. Showing concern for the victims would counter any sympathy the bombers might generate. But the decision to change the route created confusion. The motorcade's path was altered to avoid the crowded streets, where more conspirators might be waiting. The cars would drive straight along the Apel Quay to the hospital. The problem was that no one told the drivers. When the motorcade set off, the lead car turned onto Franz Joseph Street as originally planned. Franz Ferdinand's driver followed. The military governor, sitting in the front seat, realized the error and shouted for the driver to stop and reverse. The driver braked, put the car in reverse, but the engine stalled. The car sat there, motionless, directly in front of Moritz Schiller's delicatessen. Gavrilo Princip was standing outside the shop, having given up. He had been positioned earlier, but when the bomb went off, he assumed the mission was over, that police would flood the streets, that escape was now the priority. He was probably considering his next move when the Archduke's car appeared, reversed course, and stopped 5 feet from him. For a moment, he could not believe his luck, or perhaps he saw it as fate, as divine providence granting him a second chance to serve his people. He stepped forward, drew his pistol, and at point-blank range fired twice. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen, severing her stomach artery. She collapsed into her husband's lap. Franz Ferdinand, not yet realizing he had also been shot, bent over her pleading, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die, stay alive for our children." But the second bullet had hit him in the neck, cutting the jugular vein. Blood poured from the wound. Within minutes, both were dead. Their last words to each other were expressions of love and desperation. They had come to Sarajevo to celebrate their anniversary. They died together in the back of a car, victims of a boy who believed he was saving his people. Princip tried to shoot himself, but was tackled by bystanders before he could. He also tried to swallow his cyanide pill, but was beaten unconscious. When he woke, he was in police custody, 19 years old, tubercular, having just killed the heir to one of Europe's great empires. He would never be free again. As you settle towards sleep tonight, consider that moment when the car stalled. If the driver had not made a wrong turn, if the engine had not died, if Princip had been standing 10 feet in either direction, history changes. No assassination, no ultimatum, possibly no World War I, at least not in 1914, at least not triggered by this event. But perhaps this is the wrong way to think about it, because Europe in 1914 was a system designed to turn small incidents into large wars. The alliances were in place, the war plans were written, the generals were ready, the nationalists were agitating, the arms race was accelerating. The crisis of 1914 might have been avoided, but another crisis would have come. The machine was built. It only needed someone to start it. Gavrilo Princip did not start World War I. He pulled the trigger, yes, but the gun was loaded by decades of imperial competition, arms races, alliance systems, and nationalist fervor. The war that followed was not his alone. It belonged to the emperors and generals, the diplomats and politicians, the arms manufacturers and newspaper editors who had created a Europe where one death could trigger millions. In our next chapter, we will trace the 28 days from assassination to war, the ultimatums and mobilizations, the mistakes and miscalculations, the moment when Europe's leaders realized they had lost control of events but could not find a way to stop. We will watch as a Balkan crisis becomes a European catastrophe, as defensive alliances become offensive coalitions, as the old world dies and takes 17 million people with it. But that is tomorrow's horror. Tonight, rest with the image of a boy outside a sandwich shop, given a second chance by a driver's wrong turn, making a choice that would echo across a century. He believed he was saving his people. He triggered catastrophe. The gap between intention and consequence has rarely been wider. Sleep now. Tomorrow, the dominoes fall. The telegram arrived in Vienna at 3:30 p.m. on June 28, 1914. His Imperial and Royal Highness, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his consort, the Duchess of Hohenberg, assassinated by gunshot in Sarajevo. The operator who received it broke down in tears. Within hours, black flags hung from buildings across the empire. Church bells tolled. The aged Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ruled since 1848, wept for his nephew, not out of love, for they had never been close, but from the weight of another tragedy and a life saturated with them. But behind the public mourning, something else was stirring. in the offices of the Austrian Foreign Ministry, in military headquarters, in the chambers where empire's fate was decided, a different mood prevailed. Not grief, but opportunity. Serbia had been a thorn in Austria's side for years, encouraging nationalism among the empire's Slavic subjects, supporting terrorists, making Austria look weak. The assassination provided the perfect pretext to crush Serbia once and for all, to solve the South Slav problem through force. The question was not whether to punish Serbia, but how hard to strike, and whether the punishment would stay localized or spread. Because Europe in 1914 was not a collection of independent nations making free choices, it was a system of interlocking alliances where an attack on one could trigger obligations to defend, where defense could look like aggression, where mobilization schedules and railroad timetables could determine whether millions lived or died. For 28 days after Princip pulled the trigger, Europe's leaders would maneuver and bluff and miscalculate, believing they could control events, convinced that the other side would back down, certain that war could be avoided or at least contained. They were wrong about all of it. The system they had built was designed to fail catastrophically, and fail it did. Austria's first move was to ensure German support. On July 5th, a week after the assassination, the Austrian ambassador in Berlin met with Kaiser Wilhelm II and presented what amounted to a request for a blank check. If Austria attacked Serbia and Russia intervened to protect the Serbs, would Germany support Austria? Wilhelm II, impulsive and bellicose, promised full German support without consulting his ministers or considering the consequences. This was the blank check, the promise that would make Austria bold and make war far more likely. With Germany's backing guaranteed, Austria could move against Serbia without worrying about Russia. The Germans, for their part, believed Russia was bluffing, that the Tsar would not actually go to war over Serbia, that this was a chance to strengthen the alliance with Austria and perhaps weaken the Franco-Russian alliance. Both sides were miscalculating badly. The Austrians believed German support meant they could act with impunity. The Germans believed their support would make Austria strong enough that Russia would back down. Neither considered what would happen if everyone's bluff was called. But Austria moved slowly, maddeningly, fatally slowly. The empire's bureaucracy ground through procedures. Officials drafted an ultimatum designed to be unacceptable, demands that Serbia could not possibly agree to without surrendering sovereignty. The military needed time to prepare. Harvest season was underway and many soldiers were on agricultural leave. The empire mobilized at the speed of horse-drawn artillery and railroad timetables written for peacetime. Meanwhile, the world's attention drifted. 3 weeks passed. The assassination faded from front pages. Europeans went on vacation. It was summer, after all. The diplomatic crisis seemed to be fading. Perhaps Serbia would escape punishment. Perhaps the old men who ruled Europe would find a way to avoid war, as they had in previous crises. Then, on July 23rd, Austria delivered its ultimatum to Serbia. The ultimatum contained 10 demands, each calculated to humiliate. Serbia must suppress anti-Austrian propaganda and dissolve nationalist organizations. Serbia must dismiss officers and officials involved in anti-Austrian activities, names to be provided by Austria. Serbia must accept Austrian participation in the investigation and suppression of the assassination conspiracy on Serbian territory. This last demand was the poison pill. Allowing Austrian officials to operate inside Serbia would be a violation of sovereignty so complete that it effectively meant submission to Austrian control. No independent nation could accept it without ceasing to be independent. Serbia was given 48 hours to respond, 48 hours to decide whether to submit to humiliation or face invasion by a much larger empire. There was no room for negotiation built into the timeline, no diplomatic space for compromise. The ultimatum was designed to be rejected.
Serbia's response was a masterpiece of diplomatic maneuvering. Delivered just before the deadline, it accepted nearly all of Austria's demands, expressing regret for the assassination, promising to suppress anti-Austrian agitation, agreeing to dismiss officers implicated in the plot. But on the crucial point, Austrian officials operating on Serbian soil, Serbia proposed international arbitration, suggesting the matter be referred to the Hague Tribunal or to the Great Powers for mediation. It was a brilliant response. Serbia appeared reasonable, willing to compromise, open to international mediation. It accepted enough to make Austria look aggressive if it attacked anyway, but it rejected the key demand, Austrian officials in Serbia, because accepting that would mean the end of Serbian independence. Kaiser Wilhelm II, reading the Serbian response, remarked that it removed all reason for war, that Austria had received satisfaction. But Austria had no intention of backing down. The response was declared unsatisfactory. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia now faced the decision that would determine Europe's fate. Tsar Nicholas II was Serbia's protector, the defender of Orthodox Slavs against Catholic empires. To abandon Serbia would be to lose credibility, to appear weak, to invite further Austrian aggression. But to support Serbia meant confronting Austria, and behind Austria stood Germany, with the most powerful army in Europe. Russia's military situation was desperate. The empire was vast but backward, its army large but poorly equipped, its mobilization slow and vulnerable. Russian war planners knew that if they waited for Austria and Germany to mobilize first, they would be at a catastrophic disadvantage. The Russian mobilization plan required weeks to bring forces from the empire's interior to its western borders. Delay meant destruction.
So Russia began partial mobilization, calling up troops along the Austrian border but not the German border, trying to signal support for Serbia without directly threatening Germany. This was supposed to be a measured response, a warning rather than an attack. But partial mobilization created its own crisis. The Russian military discovered that their plans assumed either full mobilization or nothing. The railroad schedules, the logistics, the deployment patterns were designed for total war or peace, with no middle ground. Partial mobilization would create chaos, leaving forces scattered and vulnerable. On July 30th, the Tsar approved full mobilization, calling up over 1 million men, activating reserves, sending troops toward both the Austrian and German borders. The Russian General Staff told the Tsar this meant war. Once you mobilized, you could not stop without leaving yourself defenseless. The machinery, once started, had to run its course. Nicholas II hesitated, then signed the order. He believed he was defending Russia's interests and protecting Serbia. He was triggering a world war. Germany's response was immediate and mechanical. German war planning was dominated by the Schlieffen Plan, named for the general who had designed it. The plan assumed that Germany would fight a two-front war against France and Russia simultaneously. Since Germany could not win such a war if both enemies mobilized fully, the plan called for a rapid knockout blow against France, violating Belgian neutrality to sweep through the Low Countries and capture Paris in 6 weeks, then shifting forces east to deal with the slowly mobilizing Russians. The Schlieffen Plan had a fatal flaw. It required speed. Delay meant disaster. If Russia mobilized first and Germany waited, the window for attacking France would close. The plan was rigid, a complex choreography of railroad schedules and marching orders that could not be modified once begun. It was less a plan than a program, less a strategy than a machine that, once activated, would run until it achieved victory or collapsed. When Russia mobilized, Germany issued ultimatums. Russia must halt mobilization within 12 hours or face war. France must declare whether it would remain neutral in a Russo-German war. The ultimatums were designed to be rejected. Germany needed to appear as the defender, not the aggressor, even as it prepared to execute a plan that required invading neutral Belgium. Russia did not halt mobilization. France could not remain neutral. It was bound by treaty to support Russia.
On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. German forces began moving toward Belgium's border. Now, Britain faced its moment of decision. Britain had no formal alliance with France or Russia, only vague understandings, informal commitments, moral obligations. The British cabinet was divided. Many ministers opposed entering a continental war. The public was uncertain. What did Britain owe France? Why should British soldiers die for Serbian nationalism or Russian ambitions? Then Germany invaded Belgium.
Belgium was neutral, its neutrality guaranteed by treaty, a treaty Germany had signed. The German chancellor, trying to justify the invasion to the British ambassador, called the treaty a scrap of paper, a phrase that would haunt German diplomacy for generations. Germany needed to march through Belgium to reach France. Belgium's neutrality was inconvenient, so it was disregarded. Belgium resisted. Its small army fought back, slowing but not stopping the German advance. Stories spread, probably exaggerated, possibly fabricated, of German atrocities against Belgian civilians. German troops did shoot civilians, did burn villages, operating under a doctrine that harsh reprisals would prevent resistance. The truth was bad enough, the propaganda made it worse. Brave little Belgium became a cause célèbre, the innocent victim of German militarism. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. The violation gave the British government the moral justification it needed to enter the war. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. The dominoes had all fallen. What began as a Balkan crisis was now a European war. Austria and Germany versus Russia, France, and Britain, with smaller nations pulled into the vortex according to geography and alliance. But how did this happen? How did the assassination of one archduke produce a war involving every major European power? Let us trace the logic that led to catastrophe. Austria wanted to punish Serbia and believed German support meant it could act without Russian interference. Germany wanted to support Austria and believed Russia was bluffing. Russia wanted to protect Serbia and believed partial mobilization would deter Austria without provoking Germany. Germany's war plan required immediate attack once Russia mobilized, leaving no time for diplomacy. France was bound by treaty to support Russia. Germany's route to France went through Belgium. Britain was committed to Belgian neutrality. Each decision seemed rational from the perspective of the decision-maker. Each was disastrous in combination with the others. The system produced a war that almost no one wanted when the crisis began, but that everyone felt compelled to fight once it started. There were moments when the spiral could have been stopped. After the Serbian response to the ultimatum, Kaiser Wilhelm believed war was unnecessary, but his government ignored him, committed to supporting Austria regardless. Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm exchanged telegrams, the Willy-Nicky telegrams, pleading with each other to back down, but neither could stop the military machines of their empires were already moving, and neither could stop them without risking destruction. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey proposed a conference of the great powers to mediate between Austria and Serbia. The proposal came too late and with too little force. Austria rejected mediation. Germany supported Austria. Russia would not abandon Serbia. The window for diplomacy closed before anyone realized it had opened. On August 3rd, Grey stood at his office window watching the lamplighters illuminate London's streets. He remarked to a friend, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." It was the most prescient statement any European leader made that summer. The world that had existed before August 1914, the world of progress and prosperity, of international law and peaceful arbitration, of optimism about human rationality, was ending. What would replace it was darkness, industrialized slaughter on a scale no one had imagined possible.
The crowds that greeted the war declarations were jubilant. In Berlin, Vienna, Paris, London, St. Petersburg, people gathered in the streets to cheer. Bands played, flags waved. Young men rushed to enlist, terrified the war would end before they could see action. This was August 1914's greatest delusion, the belief that the war would be short, glorious, an adventure. The generals promised it would be over by Christmas. The soldiers believed they were defending their homelands. The populations embraced war as a release from the boredom and anxiety of peacetime, a chance for heroism and national glory. Almost no one understood what modern industrial warfare would mean, what machine guns and artillery and barbed wire would do to human bodies, how trenches would turn into graves, how the war would consume a generation. Gavrilo Princip sat in his cell, coughing blood, watching Europe tear itself apart. He had succeeded beyond his wildest imaginings. He had killed the Archduke and triggered a war that was destroying the empires he hated. But the war was also destroying Serbia, the nation he had tried to serve. Serbian casualties would be catastrophic. Over half the male population would die. The kingdom he wanted to expand would be occupied and devastated. Did he understand what he had done? Did he grasp that his 2 shots had killed 17 million people? We do not know. His interrogation transcripts show no remorse, only certainty that he had acted rightly. He believed he was a hero, a martyr for Serbian nationalism. He could not see, perhaps could not bear to see, that he was a catalyst for catastrophe, the boy who accidentally started the war that ended the world. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the 28 days we have traced. At any point, different choices could have produced different outcomes. Austria could have accepted the Serbian response. Germany could have restrained Austria. Russia could have avoided full mobilization. Germany could have modified the Schlieffen Plan. Britain could have made its position clear earlier. But none of these choices were made. Each nation acted according to its perceived interests, its treaty obligations, its military plans, its domestic political pressures. Each believed it was acting defensively, preparing for a war that the other side was starting. Each thought the other side would back down. Each was wrong. This is the terrifying lesson of July 1914, that rational actors making rational decisions can produce irrational, catastrophic outcomes, that systems designed for security can create insecurity, that alliances meant to prevent war can make war inevitable, that the machinery of modern states, with their mobilization schedules and railroad timetables and war plans, can remove human choice from human decisions. Princip pulled the trigger, but the gun had been loaded for years, cocked by decades of imperial competition and nationalist fervor and military planning. The shot that killed Franz Ferdinand was the spark. The explosion that followed was built into the architecture of European politics.
In our next chapter, we will explore how that architecture was constructed, the alliance systems and arms races, the war plans and diplomatic crises that made Europe a powder keg waiting for Princip's match. We will understand why the war could not stay localized, why defensive alliances became offensive coalitions, why the machinery of mobilization overrode human judgment. But that is tomorrow's analysis. Tonight, remember the crowds cheering in August 1914, believing the war would be glorious and brief. They were about to discover that modern war was neither. The trenches were waiting, the machine guns were ready, the old world was ending, and no one who lived through what came next would ever cheer for war again. Sleep now. The declarations are made. The armies are marching. There is no going back. The map looked like a spider's web. Lines crisscrossed Europe, connecting nations in interlocking commitments, some public, some secret, some military alliances, some mere understandings. If you pulled one strand, the whole web trembled. Pull hard enough, and the entire structure would collapse inward, dragging everything toward the center. This was Europe in 1914, not a collection of independent nations making free choices, but a system where each nation's security depended on threatening others, where defensive preparations looked like offensive plans, where peace required constant readiness for war. The machine had been built over decades, alliance by alliance, arms race by arms race, crisis by crisis. By 1914, it was complete. It only needed someone to start it.
Gavrilo Princip did not create this machine, he simply pressed the button. To understand why 2 pistol shots produced 17 million deaths, we must understand the machinery itself, how it was built, why it seemed necessary to those who built it, and why it failed so catastrophically when tested. Tonight, we trace the architecture of catastrophe, the alliance systems that divided Europe into armed camps, the military plans that turned mobilization into war, the arms races that created mutual fear, and the diplomatic crises that taught the wrong lessons. We will see how each piece seemed rational in isolation, but produced insanity in combination. We will understand why, by June 1914, Europe was an accident waiting to happen, and why that accident, when it came, could not be stopped. The machine's foundation was Otto von Bismarck's alliance system. Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor who had unified Germany through blood and iron, understood that a strong Germany frightened its neighbors. France sought revenge for its defeat in 1871 and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Russia worried about German power in Central Europe. Britain watched nervously as a new industrial giant emerged on the continent. Bismarck's solution was to make Germany indispensable, to create a web of alliances that isolated France and ensured that if war came, Germany would have friends. In 1879, he secured the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary. In 1882, he added Italy, creating the Triple Alliance. He cultivated Russia through the Reinsurance Treaty, a secret agreement that kept Russia from allying with France. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic juggling. Bismarck kept France isolated, Russia friendly, Austria dependent, and Germany secure. But it required constant attention, brilliant manipulation, and above all, restraint. Germany had to appear non-threatening while remaining strong. The system worked as long as Bismarck controlled it. Then, in 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II, young, impulsive, eager to make Germany truly great, forced Bismarck into retirement. The careful diplomatic web began to unravel almost immediately. Wilhelm let the reinsurance treaty with Russia lapse, believing Germany did not need to coddle the Russians. This was catastrophic. Russia, feeling isolated and threatened, turned to the one power Bismarck had spent 2 decades keeping isolated, France.
The Franco-Russian alliance of 1894 fundamentally altered European security. France provided capital. Russia was industrializing rapidly but needed investment. Russia provided manpower. France had a smaller population than Germany and needed allied armies. Together, they surrounded Germany with potential enemies. The nightmare scenario Bismarck had prevented, a 2-front war, was now Germany's strategic reality. Germany's response was the Schlieffen Plan, named for Count Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German General Staff. Schlieffen recognized that Germany could not win a prolonged 2-front war. If France and Russia both mobilized, Germany would be crushed between them. The only solution was speed. Knock out France before Russia could fully mobilize, then shift forces east to deal with the Russians. The plan was elegant in theory. France would be defeated through a massive right hook, German armies sweeping through Belgium and northern France, encircling Paris from the west, capturing the capital in 6 weeks. With France defeated, the full German army could turn east against Russia, whose slow mobilization would still be underway. But the plan had fatal flaws. First, it required violating Belgian neutrality, guaranteed by treaty, including by Germany itself. This would likely bring Britain into the war. Second, it required absolute precision in execution. The railroad schedules, the marching speeds, the supply lines, all had to work perfectly. Third, it assumed French and Russian behavior, that France would fight defensively, that Russia would mobilize slowly, that neither would adapt to German strategy. Most dangerously, the plan made mobilization and war almost synonymous. The moment Germany began mobilizing, it had to implement the Schlieffen Plan or leave itself vulnerable. There was no mobilization without war option, no way to prepare for conflict while continuing diplomacy.
The plan was a loaded gun pointed at France and Belgium. Once you picked it up, you had to fire. Russia faced similar constraints. Its mobilization was slow, the empire was vast, its railroad network inadequate, and its army scattered across enormous distances. Russian war planners calculated that they needed several weeks to bring forces to the western border. If they waited for Austria or Germany to attack first, they would be caught unprepared. So, Russia developed mobilization plans that emphasized speed over flexibility. Once the order was given, trainloads of soldiers would flow toward the western border according to rigid timetables. The plans assumed either full mobilization or nothing. Partial mobilization would create chaos, leaving forces scattered and vulnerable. This meant that in a crisis, Russia faced a terrible choice: mobilize fully, accepting that mobilization meant war, or stay unprepared and risk destruction. There was no middle ground, no way to signal resolve without triggering conflict. The machinery of mobilization overrode diplomatic flexibility. France faced its own dilemma. French war planning in the early 1900s was dominated by the offensive à outrance, attack to the utmost. French military theorists, traumatized by the defensive failures of 1870-71, convinced themselves that morale and offensive spirit could overcome superior German numbers and firepower. Plan 17, France's war plan, called for immediate attacks into Alsace-Lorraine and southern Germany. This was strategically insane, attacking prepared German defenses with elan and bayonets, but it served a political purpose. If Germany attacked through Belgium, France needed to be seen as the victim, not the aggressor. An offensive plan demonstrated that France was not simply waiting to be attacked, but was ready to fight for its territory. The plan was militarily absurd, but politically necessary.
Britain's position was more ambiguous. Britain had no formal alliance with France or Russia, but it had entered the Entente Cordiale with France in 1904, not an alliance, but an understanding that resolved colonial disputes and created the foundation for cooperation. In 1907, Britain reached a similar understanding with Russia, creating the Triple Entente as a counterweight to the Triple Alliance. These were not binding military commitments. Britain was not obligated to fight if France or Russia went to war, but the understandings created expectations. France and Russia believed Britain would support them. Germany feared British intervention, and Britain itself was divided. Some officials believed moral obligations required supporting France. Others insisted that Britain should stay out of continental conflicts. The ambiguity was dangerous. If Britain had made clear it would defend France, Germany might have restrained Austria in July 1914. If Britain had made clear it would stay neutral, France and Russia might have pressured Serbia to accept Austria's ultimatum. Instead, Britain sent mixed signals, hoping to preserve flexibility, while German and French planners made calculations about British intervention that shaped their war plans. British naval strategy added another layer of complexity. Britain and Germany were locked in a naval arms race, building dreadnought battleships in a competition that consumed enormous resources and generated enormous mutual suspicion. Germany wanted a navy powerful enough to challenge British naval supremacy. Britain viewed any challenge to its naval dominance as an existential threat. The Royal Navy protected the empire and the home islands. The naval race was economically wasteful and strategically pointless. Germany could never build enough ships to defeat the Royal Navy. Britain could never allow Germany to try. The race generated fear without changing the strategic balance, poisoned Anglo-German relations without serving either nation's actual security interests, and reinforced the division of Europe into hostile camps. The arms race extended to land forces as well. Germany expanded its army in 1913. France responded by extending military service from 2 years to 3, increasing the army's size. Russia launched the Great Military Program, modernizing its army and accelerating its mobilization capability.
Each increase in one nation's military prompted increases elsewhere, a spiral of preparation that made everyone less secure. The logic seemed inescapable. If your potential enemies were arming, you had to arm as well, or risk being overwhelmed. But collective arming made war more likely. More soldiers meant more pressure to use them. Faster mobilization meant less time for diplomacy. Larger armies meant higher stakes and greater devastation if war came. The arms spending was staggering. In 1914, the European powers were spending approximately 4 to 5% of GDP on their militaries, comparable to Cold War levels, higher than most nations spend today. This money went to weapons and fortifications, to railroads and strategic infrastructure, to maintaining and training massive conscript armies. The investment created powerful interests, arms manufacturers, military officers, nationalist groups who benefited from continued preparation and who would resist any reduction in tension. The generals who planned these wars had studied Napoleonic campaigns and the Franco-Prussian War of 1770 to 71. They believed in decisive battles, rapid maneuvers, the offensive as the key to victory. They had not grasped what modern weapons, machine guns, rapid-fire artillery, barbed wire, would do to attacking infantry. They imagined war as mobile and brief. They were about to discover it would be static and endless.
Previous crises had taught dangerous lessons. Europe had faced war scares before, the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, and each time the powers had stepped back from the brink. The pattern seemed clear. Threaten force, demonstrate resolve, the other side backs down, crisis resolved. This taught European leaders to believe in brinkmanship. If you stood firm in a crisis, your opponents would yield. The nation that showed weakness or hesitation would lose prestige and strategic position. So each crisis became a test of will, with leaders determined not to be the one who blinked. The problem with brinkmanship is that it works until it doesn't. Each successful crisis resolution made the next one seem manageable. Each time the powers avoided war, they grew more confident that they could avoid it again. This bred dangerous overconfidence, the belief that threats could be managed, that crises would always resolve short of war, that no one would actually be reckless enough to push things to catastrophe. In July 1914, European leaders made the same calculations they had made in previous crises. Austria believed Russia would back down if Germany stood firm. Germany believed France and Britain would stay neutral if the war seemed localized. Russia believed that mobilizing would deter Austria without forcing war. Everyone was playing the same game they had played before, but this time all the bluffs were called simultaneously. The alliance system had created a situation where every nation's security depended on its allies' support and its enemies' restraint. Trust your allies or risk isolation. Fear your enemies or risk surprise attack. The result was what historians call a security dilemma. Actions taken to increase your own security decrease others, prompting them to take actions that decrease yours, creating a spiral of mutual fear. Germany's growth made France and Russia feel insecure, so they allied. The Franco-Russian alliance made Germany feel encircled, so it built larger armies and made offensive war plans. German offensive plans made France and Russia more fearful, so they accelerated their mobilization capabilities. Faster mobilization meant less time for diplomacy, increasing the likelihood that a crisis would escalate to war before anyone could stop it. The tragedy was that almost everyone wanted peace. Businessmen wanted stable markets. Workers wanted jobs, not war. Most political leaders preferred diplomacy to conflict. Even many military officers understood that modern war would be catastrophic, but the system they had built made war increasingly likely with each passing year. The machine had a terrible logic: prepare for war to prevent it, but in preparing, make war more likely. Build alliances for security, but in allying, commit yourself to wars that might not serve your interests. Plan mobilizations for deterrence, but in planning, remove the flexibility that diplomacy requires.
The more Europe prepared for war, the more inevitable war became. There were people who saw this clearly. Socialist leaders warned that nationalism and militarism would lead to catastrophe, that workers would die for capitalists' wars. Pacifists organized against the arms race. Some far-sighted politicians argued for arms limitation and binding arbitration of disputes. They were ignored or dismissed as naive. The dominant view was that strength prevented war, that alliances created stability, that military preparation was the price of peace. The idea that the preparations themselves might cause the war they were meant to prevent was considered paradoxical, even absurd. The machine was also self-reinforcing. Military spending created industries that depended on continued spending. Conscription created millions of trained reservists whose existence made mass mobilization possible. War plans, once written, became institutional commitments that could not be easily abandoned or modified. The diplomatic commitments of one generation became the strategic assumptions of the next. By 1914, European politics had become so rigid, so bound by alliances and plans and preparations, that there was almost no room for creative diplomacy or flexible response. The system had optimized itself for turning small crises into large wars. It had removed human judgment from critical decisions, replaced statesmanship with procedure, subordinated politics to military timetables. When Princip fired his pistol on June 28th, he activated a machine that had been decades in the making. The assassination was the spark, but the explosion came from the powder that Europe had been accumulating since Bismarck's fall, the arms races and alliance systems, the war plans and mobilization schedules, the nationalist fervor and imperial competition. Could the machine have been dismantled before it destroyed Europe? Possibly, but it would have required leadership that understood the systemic risks, nations willing to sacrifice short-term security for long-term stability, military establishments willing to accept arms limitation, and populations willing to reject nationalist narratives. None of these conditions existed in sufficient strength. The momentum toward catastrophe was too great. The interests invested in the system were too powerful. The fears that motivated the arms race and the alliances were too real, based on genuine threats, on historical memories of defeat and invasion, on reasonable calculations about strategic vulnerability. The machine was built by rational people making rational choices about their nation's security. Each piece made sense in isolation. In combination, they created a system that made war almost inevitable, and once started, almost impossible to limit. This is the machine's terrible lesson, that rational people can build irrational systems, that security measures can create insecurity, that the tools meant to prevent catastrophe can cause it. As you settle toward sleep tonight, consider how the machine could be built by people who did not want war. The generals who wrote war plans believed they were providing security. The diplomats who forged alliances believed they were preventing aggression. The politicians who funded arms races believed they were protecting their nations. They were not monsters or fools. They were people facing real threats and making choices that seemed prudent at the time. But their choices, aggregated across nations and years, created a system that turned one death in Sarajevo into 17 million deaths across Europe. The gap between individual rationality and collective catastrophe has rarely been so visible. In our next chapter, we will witness what the machine produced when it was finally activated, the war that was supposed to be brief and glorious, but instead became 4 years of industrialized slaughter, the conflict that destroyed empires and killed millions, the cataclysm that shattered the 19th century's faith in progress and civilization. We will enter the trenches and understand why World War I remains, even a century later, the archetypal image of war's horror.
But that is tomorrow's darkness. Tonight, remember that the machine was built by choices, not destiny. That alliance systems and war plans are human creations, not natural laws. That the catastrophe of 1914 was not inevitable until the moment it became so. And that we, inheritors of that catastrophe's legacy, must understand how it happened to prevent it from happening again. The machine is quiet now. The empires it destroyed are gone, but the lesson remains, that preparing for war can make war inevitable, that alliances meant to prevent aggression can spread it, that the machinery of modern states can override human wisdom when the machinery is poorly designed. Sleep now,
knowing that the soldiers marching to war in August 1914 believed they would be home by Christmas. They were about to discover that the machine, once started, could not be stopped until it had consumed everything. Tomorrow, the trenches. Tonight, the last moment of the old world, before it disappeared forever into mud and blood. Rest well, the war is starting. They went to war singing. The trains that carried young men to the front were covered in flowers and patriotic slogans. Nach Paris, the Germans scrawled on their carriages. To Berlin, wrote the French. The British sang, It's a long way to Tipperary, while boarding ships for France. The Russians crossed themselves and sang Orthodox hymns as they marched toward Prussia. In every capital, crowds cheered as the armies departed. In every nation, people believed their boys would be home by Christmas, victorious and unchanged. By Christmas 1914, hundreds of thousands were already dead. The Western Front had congealed into a scar running from the Swiss border to the English Channel. 450 miles of trenches, barbed wire, and mud. The Eastern Front sprawled across 1,000 miles of forest and plain, its battles just as brutal, but more fluid, with whole armies encircling and destroying each other in campaigns of movement that nonetheless produced only stalemate. The war that everyone said would be brief and decisive had become something no one had imagined: industrial, static, total, and apparently endless. This was not war as Europeans had known it. This was something new, mechanized slaughter on a scale that defied comprehension, conducted by nations that mobilized their entire economies and populations for destruction, producing casualty rates that turned battlefields into charnel houses and made generals discuss losses of 50,000 men as acceptable costs for gaining 500 yards of mud. Tonight, we enter that war, not to glorify or to simply catalog its horrors, but to understand how Princip's 2 shots created this hell, how the machine we described produced this outcome, and how 4 years of industrialized slaughter destroyed not just millions of lives, but the entire world that had existed before 1914.
The Schlieffen Plan failed within a month. The German armies swept through Belgium as planned, their advance rapid and terrifying, but the plan required perfection, and war never provides perfection. Belgium's resistance delayed the timetable. The British Expeditionary Force, small but professional, fought with unexpected effectiveness. French forces, executing their own disastrous offensive into Alsace, could be shifted to defend Paris. And German commanders, facing the friction and chaos that Clausewitz called the fog of war, modified the plan, weakening the right wing to strengthen other sectors. The decisive moment came at the Marne River in early September. French and British forces counterattacked the German advance, which had exhausted itself in 5 weeks of marching and fighting. The Germans fell back to defensive positions along the Aisne River. Both sides then tried to outflank each other in what became known as the Race to the Sea, a series of battles extending the front northward until it reached the English Channel. By November, the trench systems were complete. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition had begun. The trenches were supposed to be temporary, positions to hold until spring, when renewed offensives would break through and restore mobile warfare. They became permanent. For 3.5 years, the Western Front barely moved. Millions of men lived in those ditches, fighting for small villages and meaningless hills, dying for gains measured in yards. The trench system was hellish in ways that photographs cannot fully capture. The front line trench, where soldiers faced the enemy across no man's land, was often waterlogged, the bottom covered in duckboards that floated in mud. Behind it ran support trenches, communication trenches connecting the front to the rear, supply trenches, command bunkers. The whole system extended back several miles, an underground city of mud and death. Living in the trenches meant existing in conditions no human should have to endure. The mud was not ordinary mud. It was a mixture of earth, water, human waste, decomposing bodies, and chemicals from explosions.
Men stood in it for days, unable to dry their feet. Trench foot, a gangrenous condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet, rotted feet inside boots requiring amputation. In winter, frostbite claimed fingers and toes. In summer, the stench of decay was overwhelming. The rats were enormous. Gorged on corpses, they grew to the size of cats. They swarmed the trenches at night, ran across sleeping men, ate rations, spread disease. Soldiers killed them constantly, shooting them, clubbing them, stabbing them, but more always came. The rats knew that where men gathered in trenches, bodies would soon follow. The lice were inescapable. Every soldier was infested. Delousing, picking the insects from clothing and crushing them, became a daily ritual. The lice carried trench fever, a debilitating illness that produced high fever, severe headaches, and pain so intense that men screamed. Recovering from trench fever took weeks, and then you returned to the trenches and were reinfected immediately. The artillery was constant. The sound never stopped, a roaring, crashing, shrieking cacophony that shattered nerves as well as bodies. Shells fell randomly, without warning. A man could be talking one moment and simply cease to exist the next, vaporized by a direct hit. Others were buried alive when trenches collapsed. Others were torn apart by shrapnel, their bodies scattered across the mud. Others went mad from the noise, the pressure, the inability to escape or fight back. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was endemic. Men who had seemed brave developed uncontrollable tremors. They wept constantly or stared blankly at nothing. Some went mute. Some went blind or deaf without physical injury. The condition was poorly understood. Many officers thought it was cowardice. Some shell-shocked soldiers were executed for desertion when they were actually suffering psychological collapse.
The general's solution to the stalemate was to attack. Massive artillery bombardments would destroy enemy trenches and wire, allowing infantry to advance and break through. This never worked. The artillery bombardments warned the enemy that an attack was coming. The defenders simply retreated to deep bunkers, waited for the bombardment to end, then emerged with their machine guns ready as the attacking infantry advanced across no man's land. No man's land was the space between the trench lines, anywhere from 50 yards to half a mile of cratered, blasted, corpse-strewn ground covered with barbed wire. Crossing it under machine gun and artillery fire was suicide, but generals ordered it anyway, believing that enough men attacking with enough determination could overwhelm any defense. The Battle of the Somme, beginning July 1, 1916, demonstrated the futility perfectly. The British conducted a week-long artillery bombardment, firing over 1 million shells. They believed nothing could survive such bombardment. On the morning of July 1st, British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and walked, not ran, across no man's land. They had been told the Germans would all be dead, that resistance would be minimal. Instead, the Germans had survived in deep bunkers. As the British bombardment lifted, they emerged with machine guns and opened fire on the advancing lines. The British soldiers, laden with 60 pounds of equipment, walking in neat lines as trained, were cut down in rows. By the end of the first day, the British had suffered 57,000 casualties, 20,000 dead, for gains measured in hundreds of yards. It was the bloodiest single day in British military history. The battle continued for 4 months. The British and French suffered 620,000 casualties. The Germans suffered 450,000. The Allies advanced about 6 miles. 6 miles! Over 1 million casualties for 6 miles of worthless mud. And this was considered a typical major offensive. Verdun was even worse. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, decided that rather than trying to break through, Germany should bleed France to death. He chose Verdun, a fortress city of symbolic importance, calculating that France would defend it regardless of cost. The battle lasted from February to December 1916.
The French did defend it, sending men through what they called the Sacred Way, the single road into Verdun, to replace the constant losses. The casualties were staggering. France suffered about 400,000. Germany suffered about 350,000. Men were fed into what participants called the mincing machine, or the mill on the Meuse. They emerged as corpses, or as broken men who would never fully recover. The forest around Verdun was obliterated. Photographs show a lunar landscape of shell craters and splintered tree stumps. In some areas, the soil is still toxic a century later, too contaminated with explosives and chemicals to support plant growth. What drove men to endure this? Partly patriotism, they believed they were defending their nations. Partly discipline, officers shot deserters, and peer pressure kept men from abandoning their comrades. Partly the human capacity to adapt. Men became numb to horror, developing dark humor and stoic acceptance as psychological shields. But mostly it was because they had no choice. Once in the trenches, you could not simply leave. The military police would catch deserters and execute them. Even if you made it through your own lines, where would you go? Your country was at war. Your family was there. Surrender meant prison camps that were often as deadly as the trenches. The only way out was victory, death, or a wound serious enough to send you home, but not serious enough to kill you. The Blighty wound British soldiers darkly joked about.
New weapons made the war even more horrible. Poison gas was first used effectively by the Germans at Ypres in April 1915. Chlorine gas, heavier than air, drifted across no man's land in a greenish-yellow cloud, sinking into trenches. Men who breathed it drowned on dry land, their lungs filling with fluid. Later gases were more sophisticated: phosgene, mustard gas, agents that blistered skin and blinded eyes and corroded lungs. Gas masks became standard equipment, but they were uncomfortable and imperfect. The gas seeped through, or men couldn't get masks on fast enough, or horses and mules, crucial for moving supplies, were unprotected and died horribly. Gas attacks added a new dimension of terror to an already nightmarish war. You could not see it coming clearly. You could not hide from it. You could only hope your mask would work. The tank was introduced by the British in 1916, designed to cross trenches and break through the deadlock. Early tanks were slow, unreliable, hot, and vulnerable, but they could cross barbed wire and withstand machine gun fire. By 1918, tanks were being used in coordinated attacks with infantry and aircraft, pioneering the combined arms tactics that would dominate future wars. Aircraft transformed from reconnaissance tools to weapons. Pilots shot at each other with pistols, then with mounted machine guns. Fighter aces became celebrities, the knights of the air, fighting individual duels above the mass slaughter below. But aircraft also dropped bombs and provided reconnaissance that made artillery more accurate. The romance of aerial combat was a thin veneer over its contribution to industrial killing. The Eastern Front was different, more mobile, covering larger spaces, but no less deadly. The Russian offensive into East Prussia in August 1914 was destroyed at Tannenberg, with 50,000 killed and 95,000 captured. The pattern repeated: offensives, encirclements, catastrophic casualties. Russia had numerical superiority, but inferior equipment, logistics, and leadership. Russian soldiers sometimes went into battle without rifles, told to pick them up from the fallen. The Russian army suffered approximately 2 million dead and 5 million captured or wounded by 1917. The casualties, combined with economic collapse and political repression, produced revolution. In March 1917, the Tsar abdicated. In November, the Bolsheviks seized power and began negotiating peace with Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, took Russia out of the war on humiliating terms, surrendering vast territories. Germany's victory in the East came too late to save it in the West. American entry into the war in April 1917 meant fresh troops and resources pouring into France. Germany's spring offensive of 1918, a last desperate attempt to win before American strength became overwhelming, made initial gains but exhausted German reserves. By summer, the Allies were counterattacking. By autumn, the German lines were collapsing.
By November, Germany was requesting an armistice. The war ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, not with victory parades, but with exhaustion. The soldiers who had survived 4 years of hell simply stopped fighting. The guns fell silent. The survivors tried to comprehend what they had lived through and what it had accomplished.
The costs were almost incomprehensible. Approximately 17 million dead, 10 million military, 7 million civilian. Another 20 million wounded, many permanently disabled, many with injuries so severe they wished they had died. Entire classes from elite schools wiped out, whole villages losing all their young men. France suffered 1.4 million military deaths, nearly 4% of its entire population, over 10% of its men. An entire generation had been fed into the mincing machine and had emerged destroyed. The economic costs were similarly staggering. Britain spent over £3 billion on the war, over $400 billion in today's money. France and Germany spent comparable amounts. The gold standard collapsed. Inflation soared. The European powers that had dominated the world economy in 1914 emerged from the war as debtors, particularly to the United States. The economic world order had shifted fundamentally. But the deeper costs were psychological and cultural. The war destroyed European civilization's faith in itself. The progress and rationality and humanitarian ideals that had characterized the 19th century seemed like naive delusions. How could a civilization that produced the Enlightenment, that banned slavery, that built cathedrals and hospitals, also produce the Somme and Verdun? How could the same nations that spoke of human dignity and scientific progress feed millions of young men into machine guns for 4 years? The lost generation, the young men who survived, returned home broken. They had left as boys, believing in honor and glory. They returned as traumatized adults who could not explain what they had experienced to people who had not been there. The literature they produced, Remarques All Quiet on the Western Front, Sassoon's poems, Graves's memoirs, captured their bitterness and disillusionment. They felt betrayed by the generation that had sent them to the trenches, lied to by the propaganda that promised glory, abandoned by societies that could not understand their trauma. The empires did not survive. Austria-Hungary dissolved into nation-states. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, its Middle Eastern territories divided among the victors. The Russian Empire became the Soviet Union, transformed by revolution. The German Empire became the Weimar Republic, democratic but unstable, burdened by defeat and reparations. The victors were hardly victorious. Britain and France had won in name, but were exhausted in reality. They had lost a generation of young men. Their economies were shattered. Their colonial subjects, who had fought and died for the empires, were demanding independence. The world order that had placed Europe at the center was crumbling. Only America emerged strengthened. It had entered late, suffered relatively light casualties, though 116,000 dead was still catastrophic, and emerged as the world's dominant economy and creditor. President Woodrow Wilson arrived at the Paris Peace Conference as a prophet of a new world order based on self-determination and collective security. His vision would be partially realized in the League of Nations and the principle of national self-determination, but it would also be betrayed by the vindictive peace imposed on Germany. Gavrilo Princip did not live to see the war's end. He died in prison on April 28, 1918, aged 23, his body wasted by tuberculosis. His last months were spent in isolation, coughing blood, denied medical treatment, slowly dying as the world he had helped destroy burned around him. His remains were buried in an unmarked grave. Later, Yugoslav nationalists would make him a hero, building monuments to the man who struck a blow for Slavic liberation. Others would remember him as the terrorist who triggered the worst catastrophe in European history. Both interpretations contain truth. Princip was a believer in a cause, willing to kill and die for it.
He was also an agent of catastrophe, the spark that ignited a conflagration he could not control or even comprehend. His 2 shots did not cause the war. The machine did that. But his shots started the machine, and once started, it could not be stopped until it had destroyed everything.
As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider what was lost between 1914 and 1918. Not just the 17 million dead, though they alone represent an ocean of grief. Not just the empires and the economic systems and the political orders, but something less tangible and more profound. The 19th century's belief in progress, in rationality, in civilization's forward march. Before 1914, Europeans believed that war between civilized nations had become unthinkable, that economic interdependence made conflict irrational, that human reason would prevent catastrophe. After 1918, they knew better. They had seen what civilization could produce when it turned its full industrial capacity toward destruction. They had learned that rational systems could produce irrational outcomes, that the tools of progress could become weapons of annihilation. The war destroyed optimism and replaced it with cynicism. It destroyed faith in authority. The generals and politicians who had promised quick victory had instead produced endless slaughter. It destroyed the old social orders, aristocracies discredited, working classes mobilized and radicalized, women having entered the workforce and proven themselves equal in competence. In our final chapter, we will trace Princip's shadow across the 20th century and into our own time. We follow the consequences of his 2 shots through Versailles and Weimar, through the rise of fascism and the outbreak of World War II, through the Cold War and decolonization to the world we inherited. We ask what lessons were learned and unlearned, what patterns persist, and whether the catastrophe that began in Sarajevo ever truly ended. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles had witnessed many grand ceremonies. Louis XIV had held court there. The German Empire had been proclaimed there in 1871, deliberately chosen to humiliate France in the very palace of French kings. Now, on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after Princip's shots in Sarajevo, the hall witnessed another historic moment, the signing of the peace treaty that was supposed to end the Great War and create a new world order. The symbolism was deliberate. The date was chosen to mark the anniversary of the assassination. The location was chosen to reverse the humiliation of 1871. Now it was Germany's turn to sign a treaty in France's palace to accept terms dictated by the victors. The German delegation was not allowed to negotiate, only to sign. When Foreign Minister Hermann Müller picked up the pen, his hands shook. He knew he was signing a document that would poison German politics for a generation. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to create lasting peace. Instead, it created the conditions for an even worse war. Within 20 years, Europe would be at war again, a war that would kill twice as many people, deploy weapons far more terrible, and produce horrors that made the trenches seem almost comprehensible by comparison. The path from Versailles to Auschwitz runs through the unresolved conflicts and festering resentments that the treaty created. Tonight, in our final chapter, we trace Princip's shadow across the 20th century and into our own time. We follow the consequences of his 2 shots through Versailles and Weimar, through the rise of fascism and the outbreak of World War II, through the Cold War and decolonization to the world we inherited. We ask what lessons were learned and unlearned, what patterns persist, and whether the catastrophe that began in Sarajevo ever truly ended.
The Treaty of Versailles was built on contradictions. President Wilson wanted a peace based on his 14 points: self-determination for peoples, open diplomacy, a League of Nations to prevent future wars. French Prime Minister Clemenceau wanted security, German power permanently broken, reparations to rebuild France, territorial guarantees against future invasion. British Prime Minister Lloyd George wanted something in between. Germany weakened but not destroyed, reparations to satisfy the public, a balance of power that would prevent future wars. What emerged satisfied no one. Germany lost 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. Parts of Prussia went to the new Poland, creating the Polish corridor that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The Rhineland was demilitarized. The German army was limited to 100,000 men, with no tanks, aircraft, or heavy artillery. The navy was reduced to a coastal defense force. Most poisonous was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which declared Germany solely responsible for the war and therefore liable for all damages. This was more than Germany's leadership could accept and more than its population would tolerate. The clause became a focus of nationalist resentment, a humiliation that politicians across the spectrum vowed to reverse. The reparations burden was staggering. The exact amount was not set in the treaty, but was later calculated at 132 billion gold marks, approximately $442 billion in today's money. Germany could not possibly pay this. The German economy, already damaged by the war and the Allied blockade, which continued until the treaty was signed, could not generate the surplus needed for such payments. The attempt to pay produced hyperinflation that destroyed the German middle class's savings. The psychological impact was even more damaging than the economic. Germans believed they had not lost the war militarily. The army had not been defeated on German soil. The armistice had been signed while German troops still occupied foreign territory. When the peace terms were revealed, terms far harsher than Germans had expected, a myth took hold, the stab in the back, Dolchstrasse-Legende. According to this narrative, the German army had been undefeated in the field, but betrayed by politicians, socialists, and Jews who had surrendered. The myth was false. The German army was collapsing in autumn 1918. The High Command knew the war was lost. But it became a powerful political weapon. It allowed nationalists to blame defeat on internal enemies rather than admitting military failure. It created scapegoats, the November criminals who signed the armistice, the democratic politicians who accepted Versailles. Adolf Hitler built his political career on this myth. The Nazi Party's entire program was based on reversing Versailles, restoring German honor, punishing the traitors who had stabbed Germany in the back. Adolf Hitler's rise to power was not inevitable. It required the Great Depression, political incompetence, and multiple other factors. But Versailles created the conditions that made Nazism possible by producing widespread resentment that could be channeled into extremism. The cruel irony is that the treaty was actually not as harsh as German propaganda claimed. Germany emerged from Versailles as potentially the strongest power in Central Europe. Its industrial base was intact. Its population was larger than France's. The new states on its eastern border, Poland, Czechoslovakia, were weak and divided. If Germany could evade the treaty's military restrictions and rebuild its strength, it could dominate the continent. This is exactly what happened. Through the 1920s, Germany secretly rebuilt its military, training pilots in the Soviet Union, developing tanks and aircraft in violation of the treaty. The Western powers, guilty about Versailles' harshness, allowed these violations. They convinced themselves that a revisionist Germany could be appeased, that meeting reasonable German demands would prevent another war.
The League of Nations, Wilson's great dream, was born crippled. The U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, meaning America, the one power with the strength to enforce the peace, never joined the League. Without American participation, the League lacked the military and economic power to restrain aggression. It became a forum for discussion, but not action, capable of passing resolutions, but not preventing wars. The League's failures were many. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned the action, but took no effective measures.
When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed sanctions so weak they were meaningless. When Germany violated the Versailles Treaty by remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, the League did nothing. Each failure made the next one more likely, teaching aggressors that international law had no teeth. The principle of self-determination, proclaimed so nobly, was applied selectively and incompletely. New nation-states were created in Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, but their borders were drawn with little regard for actual ethnic distributions. Germans found themselves minorities in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Hungarians were divided among several states. The South Slavs were forced into Yugoslavia, a state that contained Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and Bosnians who had little love for each other. Meanwhile, self-determination was not applied to colonial peoples. The German and Ottoman colonies were not given independence, but were transferred to Britain and France as mandates, effectively colonies by another name. Arab peoples who had fought for independence were divided among European powers. India, which had sent 1.5 million men to fight for Britain, received no promise of independence. The hypocrisy was glaring and would fuel anti-colonial movements for decades. The interwar period, the 20 years between the wars, was marked by trauma, economic crisis, and the rise of totalitarianism. The soldiers who survived the trenches returned home expecting gratitude and found unemployment and indifference. The promises of a land fit for heroes were broken. Many veterans felt that the war had been for nothing, that their sacrifice had been wasted, that the peace was as bad as the war. The 1920s brought a brief economic recovery, fueled by American loans and speculative investment. But the prosperity was built on unstable foundations. When the American stock market crashed in 1929, the global economy collapsed. Unemployment soared, reaching 25% in America, 30% in Germany. Banks failed, businesses closed, democracies that had seemed stable buckled under the strain. Into this crisis stepped totalitarian movements, offering simple solutions to complex problems. Communism promised workers' power and economic equality. Fascism promised national renewal and strong leadership. Both offered scapegoats, capitalists and Jews for the communists, communists and Jews for the fascists. Both rejected the messy compromises of democracy for the clarity of dictatorship. Hitler came to power legally in January 1933, appointed chancellor by a conservative elite that believed it could control him. Within months, he had destroyed German democracy, establishing a dictatorship that would plunge the world into another war. He did it by exploiting the resentments created by Versailles, the economic desperation of the Depression, and the fear of communism.
His foreign policy was explicitly revisionist, tearing up Versailles piece by piece. Rearmament in violation of the treaty, remilitarization of the Rhineland, annexation of Austria, seizure of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Each time, the Western powers acquiesced, hoping appeasement would satisfy German demands and prevent war. Each time, Hitler learned that aggression worked and prepared the next violation. The path from Princip's shots to Hitler's bunker runs through Versailles. This does not mean Versailles caused World War II. Hitler's agency, the failures of democracies, the global depression, and many other factors all contributed. But the unresolved tensions of World War I, the festering resentments created by the peace settlement, the collapse of international order, these created the conditions that made the next war possible. World War II killed 70 to 85 million people, more than 4 times the death toll of World War I. It introduced horrors the earlier war had not imagined: systematic genocide, atomic weapons, total war against civilian populations. The Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed over 200,000 and inaugurated the nuclear age. The Eastern Front produced battles that made the Somme look small: Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad. The war's end brought not peace, but a new confrontation.
The Grand Alliance that defeated Hitler, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union split almost immediately into the Cold War. For 45 years, the world lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation. Proxy wars killed millions in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. The Cold War's end in 1991 did not bring the end of history that some proclaimed, but new conflicts in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in the Middle East. Can we trace a line from Princip shots in 1914 to Srebrenica in 1995? To some extent, yes. Yugoslavia was created by the Versailles Settlement, forcing together peoples who had different religions, languages, and historical grievances. When the Cold War ended and the state fractured, the buried ethnic tensions exploded into genocide. The Bosnian War's massacres happened in the same region where Princip had fired his pistol 80 years earlier. The cycle of nationalist violence that he embodied had not ended but only paused.
What lessons did the world learn from World War I? Some were taken to heart. After World War II, the victors did not repeat Versailles' mistakes. Germany and Japan were occupied, but then rebuilt with massive aid. The Marshall Plan in Europe, similar programs in Asia. Former enemies became allies. The focus was on reconstruction rather than punishment, on integration rather than isolation. The United Nations was created with more power than the League of Nations, though it too would prove limited in preventing conflicts. NATO and other alliance systems provided collective security without the rigidity of pre-1914 alliances. The European Union emerged from the determination to make war between France and Germany impossible by binding their economies together so tightly that conflict would be unthinkable. These institutions prevented World War III during the Cold War. They created the longest period of great power peace in European history. They demonstrated that the lessons of 1914-1918 could be learned, that the mistakes of Versailles could be avoided, that a different path was possible. But other lessons were forgotten or never learned. The belief that military preparations prevent war persisted, despite 1914's demonstration that arms races and rigid alliance systems can make war more likely. The faith in military solutions to political problems survived the trenches. The willingness to use force to reshape other societies persisted through Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, each time with disappointing results that should have been predictable given World War I's lessons about the limits of military power. Nationalism, the force that drove Princip and millions like him, did not fade but intensified. The 20th century saw the triumph of the nation-state as the primary form of political organization. Empires dissolved into nations. Colonial peoples demanded and won independence, creating dozens of new nation-states. The right to national self-determination became a fundamental principle of international law. But nationalism's dark side, the xenophobia, the scapegoating, the willingness to kill for national glory, also persisted. The genocides of the 20th century were all driven by nationalist or racial ideologies. The wars were justified in nationalist terms. The terrorism was committed by nationalists of various stripes. The poison that Princip imbibed, the belief that violence in service of national liberation was noble, continues to inspire terrorist movements today. Is Princip a hero or a terrorist? The question depends on perspective. To Serbian nationalists, he remains a hero who struck a blow for freedom against imperial oppression. To others, he is the archetypal terrorist, a young fanatic who killed innocents and triggered catastrophe. Both interpretations contain truth. Princip acted from genuine political convictions, believing he was serving justice. He also murdered 2 people and inadvertently caused the deaths of millions. The ambiguity reflects a deeper problem, that one person's freedom fighter is another's terrorist, that nationalist struggles for self-determination can produce both liberation and atrocity, that the methods used to achieve political goals matter as much as the goals themselves. Princip wanted to free his people from imperial domination, a legitimate aspiration. He chose assassination,
a method that sparked a war that destroyed everything, including the people he wanted to free. Serbia suffered terribly in World War I. Austrian forces invaded and occupied the country. Over 1.2 million Yugoslavs died, nearly 30% of the population. The kingdom Princip wanted to expand was devastated. When Yugoslavia was created after the war, it included the South Slavs he dreamed of uniting, but it was a troubled state from the start, collapsing into ethnic violence when communist control ended.
Princip's personal legacy is contested in the places where he acted. In Sarajevo, his memory was celebrated under communist Yugoslavia. A museum marked the spot where he fired, his footprints were embedded in the sidewalk. After the Bosnian War of the 1990s, the museum closed and the footprints were removed. To Bosnian Serbs, he remains a hero. To Bosniaks and Croats, he is a terrorist. The assassination site is now unmarked, a deliberate forgetting because remembering is too divisive. The broader legacy of his shots is everywhere. The map of Europe was redrawn by World War I and its aftermath. The political ideologies that dominated the 20th century, communism, fascism, liberal democracy, all emerged from or were shaped by the war. The decline of European global dominance and the rise of America and the Soviet Union as superpowers stemmed from the war's economic and political consequences. The technological changes the war accelerated shaped our world. Military aviation, medical advances, chemical industries, mass production techniques, all were developed or refined for the war and then applied to civilian uses. The social changes were equally profound. Women's suffrage advanced because of women's wartime contributions. Labor unions gained strength from wartime mobilization. Class structures that had seemed permanent loosened under the pressure of shared sacrifice and trauma. The cultural legacy is harder to quantify, but no less real. Modernism in art and literature emerged partly from the war's shattering of 19th century certainties. The Lost Generation's disillusionment influenced Western culture for decades. The war poetry, Owen, Sassoon, McCrae, remains some of the most powerful anti-war literature ever written. The trauma entered the collective consciousness, shaping how subsequent generations thought about war, sacrifice, and the costs of political violence. As you settle towards sleep on this final night of our journey, consider the distance we have traveled from that sandwich shop in Sarajevo. 2 shots fired by a tubercular teenager killed an archduke and his wife. Those deaths triggered a war that killed 17 million. That war created conditions that led to a worse war that killed 70 million. Those wars reshaped the entire world, destroying empires, creating new nations, accelerating technological change, transforming social structures, and leaving traumas that persist generations later. Could any of it have been prevented? At countless moments, different choices could have produced different outcomes. If the driver had not made a wrong turn, if Austria had accepted Serbia's response, if Germany had not given the blank check, if Russia had not mobilized, if Britain had made its position clear earlier, if the generals had understood what modern weapons would do, if the peacemakers at Versailles had been wiser, if democracies had stood up to Hitler earlier. But these individual counterfactuals miss the deeper truth, that the catastrophe emerged from systemic problems: nationalism run amok, imperial competition, arms races, rigid alliance systems, military plans that removed human judgment, economic interdependence that was not matched by political cooperation. Fixing any one element might have delayed catastrophe, but would not have addressed the systemic instability. The real lesson of Princip's shots is that small actions in complex systems can have enormous consequences, that individual choices matter but are shaped by structures larger than any individual, that preparing for war can make war more likely, that seeking security through strength can create insecurity for everyone, that nationalism and militarism are dangerous drugs that produce brief highs followed by devastating crashes.
We live in a world still shaped by Princip's legacy. The nation-state system, the tension between self-determination and territorial integrity, the role of terrorism in asymmetric conflicts, the challenge of preventing wars in an interconnected world, the difficulty of building lasting peace after devastating conflicts. All these trace back to the crisis that began in Sarajevo. We face new versions of old problems. Cyber warfare and nuclear weapons have made conflict potentially more catastrophic than anything World War I produced. Climate change creates pressures that could trigger new conflicts. Nationalism is resurgent in many countries. The international institutions created after World War II are under strain. The lessons learned at such terrible cost are being forgotten as the generation that lived through the wars passes away. But we also have knowledge that previous generations lacked. We know what world wars look like. We know that nationalism and militarism lead to catastrophe. We know that peace requires institutions and compromise and the willingness to subordinate narrow interests to collective security. We know that preventing war is far better than winning it. The question is whether we will use this knowledge. Gavrilo Princip died believing he had served his people. He had actually helped destroy them and millions of others. His shots did not start World War I. The machine did that. But his shots started the machine. And once started, the machine could not be stopped until it had consumed everything in its path. The machine is quiet now. The empires it destroyed are gone. The soldiers it killed are remembered on memorials and in ceremonies. The world it created, our world, struggles with the legacy of the catastrophe, trying to honor the sacrifice while avoiding the mistakes, remembering the horror while preserving the peace. Princip's shadow is long. It stretches across the 20th century and into our own time. It reminds us that individual actions matter, that small events can cascade into disasters, that the world is connected in ways we do not always see until the connections produce catastrophe. It reminds us that preventing war requires understanding the systems that produce war, addressing root causes rather than simply managing symptoms, building institutions that can prevent small crises from becoming large ones. Sleep now, knowing that the world Princip helped destroy was imperfect, but was also the only world millions of people knew. That the world his shots helped create is also imperfect, but is the one we must live in and improve. That the lessons of his accidental catastrophe are still relevant, still urgent, still demanding our attention. Tomorrow, you wake in a world that still bears the scars of the wars that began in Sarajevo, the borders drawn at Versailles, the institutions created after 1945, the tensions that persist between national sovereignty and international cooperation, the memories of the dead and the lessons of their sacrifice. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. History is not destiny. The patterns can be broken. The mistakes need not be repeated. But only if we remember what happened, understand why it happened, and commit to doing better. The boy with the pistol is dead. The Archduke is dead. The soldiers are dead. The empires are dead. But the world their deaths created lives on. We are Princip's inheritors, whether we know it or not. What we inherit is both the world the wars created and the responsibility to ensure that such catastrophes never happen again. The lamps went out across Europe in August 1914. Some have been relit. Others still flicker in the darkness. The work of keeping them lit continues. Rest well. The long shadow is cast, but the future is not yet written. Tomorrow begins again.